In the summer of 2021, a family of 4 set up camp in a designated backcountry site in the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. They had done everything correctly. They had selected an established campsite. They had a permit. They had a bear canister for food storage. They cooked away from their tents, suspended their garbage in a tree at the regulation height, and rinsed their dishes thoroughly before packing them away. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning, a grizzly bear entered their camp. It moved directly past the tent where the parents were sleeping, past the camp chairs and the fire ring, and went straight to the cooking area 40 yards away, where the family had stored a folded camp towel they had used to dry dishes. The towel was clean by any reasonable human standard. It had been rinsed. It had been aired. It smelled, to the people who had used it, like nothing at all. The bear dismantled the storage arrangement, retrieved the towel, spent several minutes investigating the area immediately surrounding where it had been hung, and then left. No one was injured. Nothing edible was actually taken. What the bear had come for was not food. It had come for a smell that was food adjacent, at a distance that human beings cannot meaningfully perceive, and it had traveled what wildlife managers later estimated to have been between 4 and 6 miles to reach it. This is the story that does not fit cleanly into the version of bear-human interaction that most people carry with them into the backcountry. The version most people have absorbed from ranger station pamphlets and outdoor recreation guides describes a straightforward transaction. Food attracts bears, you store your food properly, bears do not visit your camp. The guidance is not wrong. It is incomplete. The gap between what the guidance describes and what is actually happening when a grizzly bear moves toward a human campsite at night is a gap that matters, not because the standard precautions are useless, they are not, but because understanding what is actually driving the behavior produces a fundamentally different and more accurate picture of the challenge involved in sharing a landscape with an animal whose sensory relationship to the world is so different from our own that the practical implications are almost impossible to fully internalize. Before we go any further, if you are finding this useful, if this is the kind of detailed, honest treatment of predator behavior and human safety that you want more of, take a moment right now and subscribe. There is a lot more of this kind of work coming, and subscribing makes sure you do not miss it. The grizzly bear's olfactory system is the foundation of everything that follows, and it requires a genuine effort to understand rather than simply acknowledge, because the numbers that describe it are large enough to slide off the surface of intuitive comprehension without making contact with anything meaningful. The grizzly bear has approximately 2,100 square centimeters of olfactory mucosa, the sensory tissue lining the nasal cavity that actually detects and processes scent molecules. The human being has approximately 10 square centimeters. The ratio is not a small difference. It is not even the same order of magnitude. It is the difference between a device designed to detect one thing at a time and a device designed to detect everything simultaneously at concentrations that a human instrument cannot register at all. The grizzly's nose contains more scent-detecting cells per square centimeter than a bloodhound, an animal specifically bred over centuries for the intensity of its olfactory capability. Wildlife biologists who study bear behavior have described the grizzly's sense of smell as being to the human nose what the Hubble Space Telescope is to a pair of reading glasses from a pharmacy rack. Both are looking at the same universe. They are not seeing the same thing. The practical expression of this capability is what makes grizzly bears so difficult to exclude from human spaces through the kind of common-sense food management that works reasonably well with less olfactorily gifted animals. A grizzly bear can detect carrion at a distance of 20 miles under favorable wind conditions. This is a documented finding from wildlife research, not an approximation or a worst-case estimate. 20 miles. At that distance, the concentration of scent molecules reaching the bear's nose from a dead elk is, by any instrument a human chemist could bring to bear on the measurement, effectively 0. There is nothing there to detect. The molecules present are present in concentrations that human analytical equipment struggles to confirm. The bear detects them. The bear orients toward them. The bear begins moving. This is not an impressive trick. This is the routine operation of a sensory system built by 40 million years of evolution to do one thing with extraordinary efficiency, which is find food in a landscape where food is unevenly distributed, seasonally variable, and often hidden beneath snow, soil, or the surface of water. The bear's nose is not a feature. It is the primary instrument through which a grizzly understands its environment. Everything the bear knows about what is in the world around it, and where it is, and whether it matters, is processed through that instrument first. Now consider what a campsite smells like to an animal operating with that instrument, from a distance of 4 miles, downwind, at 2 in the morning. The cooking smells are the most obvious component. Bacon grease that has been wiped from a pan but not eliminated. The residue of marinara sauce that was rinsed from a pot but not scrubbed with a dedicated cleaning agent. The faint carbon signature of a wood fire where food was cooked, specifically the particular molecular signature of wood smoke that has combined with the volatiles produced by cooking animal protein. These are strong signals by any standard, and they are what most people focus on when thinking about bear attractants. But they are not the whole picture, and in some well-managed camps, where cooking protocol has been followed carefully, they are not even the primary signal. The secondary layer of scent is harder to conceptualize because it involves materials that humans do not think of as food-related at all. A tube of lip balm that contains vanilla flavoring, a bar of soap with a floral or fruity scent, a stick of deodorant, a tube of toothpaste, a bottle of sunscreen. These products, carried into the backcountry without a second thought, because they are personal hygiene items rather than food, produce olfactory signals that a grizzly bear processes through the same part of its brain that processes food signals. Because the volatile organic compounds they contain are in many cases identical or chemically similar to the compounds produced by ripening fruit, fermenting vegetation, or rendered animal fat, which are among the most important food signals in the bear's ecological experience. The bear is not confused. It is not making an error. It is responding to a chemical signature that its evolutionary history has wired it to pursue, and the fact that the source is a tube of chapstick rather than a patch of wild huckleberries is a distinction that exists in the human framework for categorizing objects and does not exist in the framework through which the bear's olfactory system processes molecular information. The tertiary layer is the one that produces the most counterintuitive outcomes and the ones most likely to frustrate campers who believe they have done everything right. Human beings produce a continuous chemical signature through normal metabolic activity. Sweat, breath, the oils produced by skin and hair, the residual chemical traces left on fabrics by extended contact with a human body. All of these create a scent envelope around every person and every piece of gear they touch. The critical point about this envelope is that it is not neutral to a grizzly bear. It is not a signal that means nothing. It is a signal that means something specific, and what it means has changed over the past several decades in ways that have direct implications for the frequency and nature of bear-human encounters in the backcountry. In wilderness areas where grizzly bears have had extended negative interactions with humans, specifically in populations that experience significant hunting pressure or where human-bear encounters reliably involved aversive outcomes for the bear. The human scent envelope is a deterrent. Bears that have learned through direct experience or through cultural transmission, in the loose sense in which bears pass behavioral information across generations, that the smell of humans is associated with danger, pain, or unpredictable aggression, treat the human scent signal as a reason to withdraw rather than investigate. This was the condition of grizzly bear populations in most of their range through the mid-20th century. When hunting was widespread, human-bear encounters in the backcountry were far less common, and the bears that survived to reproduce were disproportionately bears that had learned to treat human scent as an alarm signal. The decades since, in which human recreation in grizzly habitat has expanded dramatically, hunting pressure in wilderness areas has declined or been eliminated in some jurisdictions, and wildlife management programs have prioritized non-lethal resolution of human-bear encounters wherever possible, have produced a measurable shift in the behavioral profile of grizzly bears in the most heavily visited wilderness areas. Not a shift toward aggression. The distinction between conditioned aversion and aggression is important and will be addressed directly. What has shifted is the threshold of investigation. Bears whose developmental experience has not included reliable negative associations with human scent are more likely to investigate novel human-associated smells and less likely to withdraw at the first detection of human presence. The radius at which a bear turns around and goes the other direction is smaller. The probability that a bear will follow a scent signal to its source, rather than simply orient toward it briefly and then move on, has increased in the populations that have experienced the most intensive human contact without consistent negative consequence. This behavioral dynamic is documented in the scientific literature on bear habituation, and it produces a specific, practical problem at the campsite scale. The campsite that has been used by many different groups of humans over the course of a season is not a blank slate. It carries a complex, accumulated scent history. The fire ring holds the molecular residue of dozens of cooking events. The soil around the eating area has absorbed trace food compounds from spills and cooking vapor deposition over many uses. The established tent pads have been saturated with human body scent from extended contact over many nights of use. The result is a location that, to a grizzly bear investigating the area for the first time, is saturated with food-adjacent and human-associated chemical signals at levels that represent the concentrated history of the site rather than just the current occupant's activity. The bear approaching this campsite from miles away is following a scent signal that is not merely the result of tonight's dinner. It is following the accumulated olfactory record of the site itself, and that record is often far more intense than the current occupants have any awareness of. The way grizzly bears move through landscapes at night deserves specific attention because it is so different from how people imagine large predators moving that it fundamentally shapes the character of the encounters that occur. Grizzly bears are not ambush predators in the mountain lion sense. They do not rely on stealth in the same way. They are not hunting humans when they move toward campsites at night, and this distinction is not semantic. It is mechanistically important. A grizzly bear approaching a campsite is following a scent trail. It is doing what grizzly bears do all day, every day, in every habitat they occupy, which is moving toward chemical signals that have been associated by experience or instinct with caloric resources. The behavior is not inherently aggressive. The bear is not making a decision to confront humans. It is making a decision to investigate a smell, and the investigation arrives at a place that happens to contain humans. The way this investigation plays out depends on what happens when the bear actually encounters the human presence directly. A bear that arrives at the edge of a campsite detects the immediate, close-range sensory presence of humans who are awake and moving and making noise, and has learned through prior experience, that this immediate presence signal is associated with negative outcomes, will typically withdraw. It may withdraw slowly, with the kind of deliberate non-urgency that characterizes a large, confident animal that has decided the situation is not dangerous to it, but is also not productive. And this slow withdrawal is often more alarming to the humans watching it than a faster retreat would be, because it does not read as fear, it reads as assessment. And it is assessment. The bear is not afraid. It is deciding. The decision to withdraw is based on a cost-benefit calculation that involves, on the cost side, the history of this specific animal's experiences with humans, the current behavioral signals being produced by the humans in the camp, the time and energy already invested in reaching the site, and on the benefit side, the strength of the scent signal that brought it there and the assessment of whether there is something retrievable worth the continued investment. This is the moment that determines whether a campsite encounter remains a campsite encounter or escalates into something else. And it is a moment that very few people who have not experienced it are prepared to navigate correctly. Because the preparation required is not about physical strength or weapons or even the quick deployment of bear spray. It is about understanding the animal's decision framework well enough to produce the behavioral signals that shift the cost-benefit calculation in the right direction, which is away from the camp and away from the humans in it. The critical behavioral error that people make in this moment is almost always the same error, and it is an error driven by the same instinct that makes people effective at deterring mountain lion encounters, which is the instinct to make noise and draw attention to oneself. In a mountain lion encounter, as the reference framework for this kind of analysis establishes clearly, making noise, standing tall, and behaving assertively is the correct response because it produces signals that do not match the mountain lion's prey template and trigger avoidance rather than predatory engagement. In a grizzly bear encounter, the behavioral calculus is different in ways that require specific explanation. A grizzly bear is not operating on a prey detection template in the same way a mountain lion is. It is an omnivore whose relationship with other large animals, including humans, is filtered through a framework of dominance assessment rather than prey selection. When a grizzly encounters a human at close range, the first question its nervous system is processing is not the same question a mountain lion's nervous system is processing. The mountain lion is asking whether this thing is prey. The grizzly is asking whether this thing is a threat. The answer to that question and the behavior it triggers in the bear depends heavily on the specific context, the distance of the encounter, the bear's prior experience, whether it has cubs or a food cache it is defending, and whether it perceives itself to have an escape route. These contextual variables produce different bear behaviors that require different human responses, and the conflation of these different scenarios into a single standard response protocol is one of the sources of the dangerous gap between what most people know about bear encounters and what the encounters actually require. A surprised bear at close range is a different situation from a bear that has been approaching a campsite over a long distance following a scent trail. The surprised bear, a bear that encounters a human at close range without prior warning and with no time to assess and decide, is in a state of acute threat response, and the behavior it produces, which in grizzly bears is often a defensive charge, reflects the threat response framework rather than the predatory framework. Defensive charges by grizzlies are almost always exactly what they appear to be: a defensive response to a perceived threat. The bear is not attacking in the predatory sense. It is defending. This is why the standard advice for a grizzly charge from a surprised bear is to deploy bear spray, to not run, and if physical contact is unavoidable, to protect the vital areas and play dead, because the bear's goal in a defensive charge is to neutralize the threat, and an animal that has stopped moving and stopped presenting threat signals has achieved that goal from the bear's perspective, even if the bear is not consciously reasoning through these categories. The nighttime campsite visitor is a different situation. The bear that has traveled 4 miles following a scent gradient has had time to assess and decide. It is not in a state of acute threat response. It is in an investigative state. This distinction matters enormously for how the encounter should be handled and for why certain responses work and others do not. Making sudden loud noise at close range, which would be exactly right in a mountain lion encounter and exactly right if you wanted to deter a black bear, can produce a startle response in a grizzly that is already in close proximity. The startle response in a large, powerful animal that was already committed to investigation can trigger a defensive response that the noise was intended to prevent. This is not a theoretical concern. It is documented in the incident record. The encounters that produced injuries from grizzlies that had approached campsites at night and were then startled at close range include cases where the bear's behavior shifted from investigative to defensive in the moments following a sudden loud noise or a sudden aggressive movement from a human who had just woken up and had no time to assess the situation before reacting. The appropriate response to a bear in camp at night is calm, firm, organized, and oriented toward giving the bear a reason to leave rather than a reason to escalate. This means speaking in a low, firm voice. It means activating lights gradually rather than suddenly. It means positioning bear spray accessibly, but not raising it in a movement that a bear in close proximity might read as a threatening gesture before you have assessed whether the bear is already withdrawing. It means making your presence known as a human presence, specifically as something large and unpredictable and not worth the continued investment, rather than as a panicked prey animal or as an immediate threat that triggers defensive aggression. The fine line between these behavioral categories is not theoretical. It is the line that separates the majority of campsite grizzly encounters, which end with the bear withdrawing without physical contact, from the minority that do not. The food storage technology dimension of this problem is one where the gap between the guidance and the actual protective effect is most consequential and least openly discussed in outdoor recreation communities. Bear canisters, the hard-sided containers that backcountry users in mandatory canister zones are required to carry, are effective at preventing bears from accessing food. They are not effective at preventing bears from smelling food. A properly sealed bear canister significantly reduces the volatilization of scent from the food inside it, but it does not reduce it to zero. A grizzly bear, investigating a campsite that contains a properly sealed bear canister, positioned according to the regulations, still receives a detectable scent signal from that canister. The canister succeeds because it denies the bear the caloric reward that would make the visit worth repeating. The conditioning value of the canister is not that it makes the food undetectable. It is that it makes the food inaccessible, so that the bear that is drawn to the camp by scent finds nothing retrievable and leaves without a reinforcing caloric reward. Over time, in theory, this conditions bears away from campsite visitation by breaking the association between the scent signal and the food reward. In practice, the conditioning effect requires consistency across a landscape that rarely achieves it, because not every campsite in a given area is using canisters. Not every canister is being used correctly, and the scent signals from the accumulated history of site use persist long after any specific group has left. The hang system, the rope and tree method of suspending food between trees or from a single high branch at a regulation distance from the ground, has a more ambiguous effectiveness record than the outdoor recreation community's adoption of it as standard practice might suggest. Grizzly bears are large, powerful animals with an exceptional ability to assess the spatial layout of a hanging system, and, in some documented cases, to retrieve food from hangs that met regulation specifications. A full-grown grizzly, standing upright, can reach approximately 9 feet. A bear that identifies a food hang and is motivated to retrieve it has demonstrated the ability to climb trees, to test the tension of the rope against the limb it is suspended from, to break limbs with sufficient force to bring the hang down, and to locate and access cached food in ways that the hang system designers did not anticipate. This is not a reason to abandon hang systems where canisters are not available. It is a reason to understand them as a barrier that reduces the probability of successful food retrieval rather than as an absolute exclusion. The goal is always to raise the cost of the bear's investigation until it exceeds the expected caloric return. The hang system raises that cost. It does not always raise it above the threshold of a determined, experienced, nutritionally motivated grizzly. The electric fence option, which has been standard equipment for scientific research camps and guide outfitter operations in grizzly country for decades, has begun moving into the lightweight backpacking equipment market in a way that reflects both the real utility of the technology and the growing awareness among serious backcountry users that the standard food storage protocols have limitations at the far end of the risk distribution. A properly configured electric fence around a campsite does not prevent a bear from detecting the camp by scent. It does not prevent the bear from approaching the camp. What it does is produce a reliable aversive stimulus at the perimeter of the camp that a bear that contacts it associates with the campsite itself. The conditioning value of the electric fence is higher than the conditioning value of a bear canister because the negative stimulus is more immediate, more intense, and more directly associated in the bear's experience with the campsite as a location rather than with a specific piece of equipment. Bears that have contacted electric fences in camp settings in research environments have demonstrated the behavioral learning that the deterrent is intended to produce. The limiting factors are weight, setup time, and the difficulty of finding appropriate anchor points in above treeline or rocky terrain. As the equipment has become lighter and the anchor systems more versatile, the trade-off has shifted in ways that make electric fence camping a legitimate option for serious backcountry users in high-density grizzly areas, rather than just an outfitter tool. Bear spray deserves specific, careful, and extended treatment because it is simultaneously the most effective short-range deterrent available to people in grizzly country and the most misunderstood piece of safety equipment in common use in the backcountry. The research on bear spray effectiveness is more robust than the research on almost any other aspect of human-grizzly interaction, and the results are striking. A peer-reviewed analysis of brown bear encounters in Alaska, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, found that bear spray stopped what were classified as aggressive encounters in 92% of cases, and that in those cases, none of the people who used it sustained serious injuries. In comparison, firearms, which represent the alternative deterrent most often cited by people skeptical of the spray's effectiveness, stopped aggressive encounters at a lower rate in the same dataset and produced higher rates of injury to the humans involved. The injury rate difference is partly a function of the nature of the deterrent. Bear spray works at a distance of 25 to 30 feet. It produces a cloud of capsaicin-based irritant that saturates the bear's olfactory system, which, given what has already been established about the intensity and centrality of that system, produces a response that is immediate and overwhelming. The bear does not need to be convinced to stop. It is physically incapacitated from continuing at close range. The firearm's outcome is variable. In a way, the spray outcome is not, because shooting a charging grizzly bear with a firearm under conditions of acute stress, at the distances at which the charge becomes a contact threat, with the adrenaline and motor disruption that accompanies that level of threat, is a genuinely difficult task, even for experienced shooters. The misunderstanding of bear spray is typically about deployment. People carry it clipped to their pack in a position from which it cannot be quickly accessed. They have not practiced the draw and deployment motion. They wait too long to deploy it because they do not want to waste a canister that costs $50 and contains only one use. They do not understand that the spray should be deployed when the bear is at 25 to 30 feet and closing, not when it is at 5 feet, because at 5 feet, the window for effective deployment in front of the bear's path has closed. The people who have used bear spray effectively describe a specific muscle memory deployment that comes from practice, not from having read the instructions. The canister should be accessible from a hip holster. The deployment motion should be practiced enough times that it does not require conscious planning under stress. The targeting, which is not at the bear specifically, but at the space between you and the bear through which it is moving, should be understood before the situation requires it. The difference between a person who has practiced this and a person who has not is the difference between a deterrent that works 92% of the time and a deterrent that never gets deployed correctly at all. The question of what actually draws grizzly bears to campsites at night has a more complex answer than the standard summary of food storage practices suggests. And developing that complexity requires looking at the full range of scent signals that a camp produces and how they interact with the grizzly's sensory and behavioral systems. The food component, while real and important, is not the only component and is not always the dominant one. Several categories of camp-produced scent draw specific attention here because they are consistently underweighted in the public conversation about campsite bear safety. Menstrual odors have been the subject of a specific and sometimes contentious discussion in the bear safety literature. Early studies, conducted in the 1980s at sites where polar bears were the primary concern, suggested a correlation between menstruation and bear investigation that prompted some wildlife agencies to issue guidance recommending that menstruating women avoid backcountry travel in bear country altogether. Subsequent research, specifically research focused on grizzly bears and black bears rather than polar bears, has produced a more nuanced picture. The 1991 study by Herrero and Higgins, which remains among the most comprehensive analyses of menstrual odor and bear response, found no evidence that menstruating women were at elevated risk of attack from grizzlies or black bears. The distinction between polar bear behavior and grizzly bear behavior in this context appears to be real, and the blanket guidance issued in the 1980s is no longer the official position of most wildlife management agencies. What is acknowledged is that menstrual blood produces a detectable biological scent signal that grizzlies can and will investigate, and that the management of used hygiene products follows the same protocol as the management of food waste, in the sense that they should be stored in sealed containers away from sleeping areas and packed out rather than buried. The investigation of the scent is not evidence of predatory intent. It is evidence of the olfactory system doing what it does, which is investigate novel biological materials. The practical guidance that follows from this distinction is different from the guidance that would follow if the investigation were associated with elevated attack risk. Fish and wildlife-related scents represent a category that is disproportionately represented in the campsite encounter literature relative to the frequency with which anglers and hunters discuss it as a risk factor. Fishing and fishing-adjacent activities, cleaning fish, packing fish, handling fish, and then handling gear without thorough washing produce scent signals that are among the most potent attractants in the grizzly's experience. Salmon and trout, in particular, fish species that constitute critical caloric resources for grizzly bears in the ecosystems where both species co-occur, produce scent signatures that grizzly bears have evolved to detect and pursue with a level of motivation that exceeds almost any other food signal in their environment. A camp that has processed fish, even a camp that has attempted to clean up thoroughly by human standards, carries a fish scent burden that is, to a grizzly bear, essentially a direct invitation. The residue on hands that have handled fish persists through multiple hand washings with soap. It penetrates fabrics. It deposits on tent surfaces when fish handling gear is stowed nearby. The people who understand this most clearly are the guide outfitters and fishing lodge operators in Alaska and British Columbia, who have developed extremely specific protocols around fish processing in bear country that go well beyond anything in standard backcountry recreation guidance. And the gap between those protocols and what the average recreational angler does in the same habitat is a gap that produces the incidents. Garbage and food waste management is the category where the behavioral economics of bear conditioning are most directly in play, and where the systemic failure that individual careful campers cannot protect themselves against is most clearly visible. A single improperly managed garbage incident at a campsite or trailhead can produce a conditioning event that draws bears back to that location repeatedly, because the caloric reward of a garbage find is large enough relative to the search cost to make the location permanently attractive in the bear's spatial memory. Research on grizzly bear home range use has documented cases where individual bears, after a single successful garbage or food cache finding at a specific location, return to that location at intervals of days or weeks for months following the initial event, even after the attractant has been entirely removed. The spatial memory that records the location of the initial reward persists long after the reward is gone. The implication for campsite management is that a single bad actor in an otherwise well-managed camping area does not just expose themselves to a bear encounter. They expose everyone else in the area for the remainder of the season and beyond, because the bear they have conditioned now includes that location in a regular patrol route. The trailhead and car camping interface is a specific context that receives insufficient attention in the bear safety discussion because it falls between the detailed protocols of the serious backcountry and the everyday complacency of a campground that feels, because of its developed infrastructure and its proximity to other people, more like a managed environment than a wilderness one. Developed campgrounds in grizzly bear range are not safe from grizzly incursion by virtue of their infrastructure. Campgrounds with bear boxes and food storage lockers, campgrounds with regular ranger patrols, campgrounds where the rules are posted on large signs at the entrance, continue to experience grizzly bear visits at rates that reflect the reality that the regulatory infrastructure has not transformed the olfactory environment in a way that matches the behavioral expectation it has set. People cook in campgrounds with a freedom they would not exercise in the backcountry. They leave ice chests in cars whose windows crack open for ventilation on warm nights. They discard cooking grease at the edge of the fire ring rather than packing it out. They store toiletries in tents because the food locker is 20 yards away and it is late and they are tired. Each of these behaviors produces scent signals in an environment that may be within a mile of active grizzly movement corridors, and the developed infrastructure of the campground provides no reduction in the grizzly's ability to detect those signals from a distance. The vehicle storage question specifically is one where the gap between what people know and what they do is large and consequential. A car with windows closed and food stored inside is, by the standards of most campground regulations, legal. It is not safe. Grizzly bears have entered vehicles by breaking windows, deforming door frames, and in documented cases, accessing vehicles through sunroof openings in pursuit of food scent from the interior. The grizzly's ability to assess the source of an intriguing scent and apply significant physical force in pursuit of it is not limited to soft-sided tents or hanging food bags. A bear, motivated by a strong scent signal, is physically capable of gaining access to most vehicle interiors, and has done so in documented incidents across multiple jurisdictions in grizzly range. The hard-sided lockable food storage infrastructure of developed campgrounds exists for a reason that goes beyond regulatory compliance. It exists because the alternative storage options available in a vehicle or a tent, options that would be adequate against almost any other wildlife threat, are not adequate against an animal with the olfactory capability and the physical capability of a large grizzly. The Cubs of the Year dimension of campsite encounters introduces a behavioral dynamic that is different in character from the food-seeking dynamics described so far, and that produces the most serious injury risk of any bear encounter scenario. A female grizzly with cubs is operating under a behavioral mandate that supersedes the normal cost-benefit calculus of food-seeking. Defending cubs from perceived threats triggers a defensive aggression response in female grizzlies that is faster, less discriminating, and more difficult to interrupt than any other aggression type in the species. The critical fact about female grizzlies with cubs approaching campsites is that they do not come primarily because the campsite smells like food. They come because the campsite is located within the range they are traveling through, and their route takes them through or near the campsite regardless of what the campsite contains. The sow with cubs is not primarily a food-seeking campsite visitor. She is a landscape-using animal whose landscape includes the campsite, and her interaction with humans in that context is not about what the camp smells like, but about the close-range encounter that results when two parties that would both prefer not to see each other suddenly do. The defensive charge from a sow with cubs at close range is one of the most dangerous encounters in North American wildlife. Not because it necessarily results in severe injury. The statistics on defensive grizzly charges ending in withdrawal before contact are reasonably reassuring, but because the speed and commitment of the behavior leave almost no margin for error in the human response. The bear is not making a considered decision at that moment. It is executing a hard-wired threat neutralization response that has been favored by millions of years of selection pressure because female bears that aggressively defended their cubs against threats had higher cub survival rates. The human who encounters this at 30 feet in dense brush has approximately 1.5 seconds to deploy bear spray correctly before the geometry of the encounter makes deployment difficult or impossible. The 1.5 seconds require muscle memory. They require a canister that is accessible. They require enough prior exposure to the deployment sequence that the hands can execute it while the mind is processing the shock of the situation. Most people do not have these things. Most people have a canister in a pack pocket and no rehearsed deployment motion and no prior experience of processing a threat at this speed. The gap between what is required and what most people bring to the encounter is the gap in which the injuries happen. The grizzly bear attack record in North America over the past 4 decades tells a specific story about where and how people are getting hurt, and that story is worth examining carefully because it reveals patterns that the standard safety guidance does not fully address. The aggregate data on grizzly attacks from the comprehensive analysis conducted by bear biologist Stephen Herrero, whose work represents the most thorough scientific treatment of the subject available, shows a consistent set of contextual features in the attacks that resulted in serious injury or death. The victim was frequently alone or separated from companions when the encounter occurred. The encounter frequently happened in dense vegetation that reduced visibility and eliminated the buffer distance in which spray deployment is most effective. The encounter frequently involved a surprised bear rather than an approaching bear, meaning there was no approach phase in which the human could have detected the bear before the bear was already in close contact range. The bear was frequently a female with cubs or a bear on a carcass. In both cases, an animal in a defensive rather than predatory posture. And the human response, in cases where it has been possible to reconstruct from survivor accounts and physical evidence, was often a flight response that triggered pursuit, rather than a stationary response that might have triggered the defensive charge's completion and immediate end without continued contact. This last point is the most important and the least intuitively navigable. The advice to stand your ground and not run from a charging grizzly is correct. It is also profoundly difficult to execute without prior mental preparation, because it requires overriding an instinct that is deep, immediate, and physiologically powerful. The fight-or-flight response, triggered by a large predator at close range and closing fast, is not a considered decision. It is a cascade of neurological events that begins before consciousness catches up with the situation. The people who successfully stand their ground against a grizzly defensive charge have, in most documented cases, had prior mental rehearsal of the scenario, meaning they had thought through what they would do before they were doing it. This is not a performance of bravery. It is the application of prior planning at a moment when unplanned behavior would be counterproductive. The mental rehearsal of a charge encounter, deciding in advance that you will not run, deciding in advance that you will deploy spray at 25 feet, deciding in advance that if contact occurs, you will protect your vital areas and stay down and not resist, produces behavioral outcomes that the absence of that rehearsal does not. This is documented. It is the most important thing that anyone planning to travel in grizzly country can do, and it is the thing that is most consistently absent from the preparation of people who have done everything else correctly. The seasonal dimension of grizzly behavior around human camps follows the arc of the bear's annual hyperphagia and denning cycle in ways that are predictable enough to inform campsite planning and risk assessment. The period of hyperphagia, the intense period of pre-denning caloric loading that occurs from late summer through early fall, represents the peak period of food-motivated bear activity and the period of highest campsite visitation risk from food-seeking grizzlies. During hyperphagia, a large grizzly may consume up to 20,000 calories per day, and the behavioral drive to find and consume food during this period is more intense and more overriding of normal avoidance behaviors than at any other point in the year. A bear in hyperphagia that detects a food signal from a campsite is operating with a motivational intensity that is higher than the same bear would bring to the same signal in June. The cost-benefit threshold at which the bear decides the investigation is not worth continuing is higher during this period. The bear will travel farther, persist longer, and be less deterred by human behavioral signals during the hyperphagia period than at any other time of year. The spring emergence period, when bears exit dens after several months of dormancy, having consumed nothing for that entire period, represents the other elevated risk window. An emerging bear, particularly a male that may weigh significantly less than it did at denning, is in a state of acute nutritional demand. Spring in grizzly range is not a period of abundant food. Snow still covers much of the landscape. Ungulate carcasses from winter mortality are among the primary food resources, and the bears that find them guard them with an intensity that makes the approach of a human to a spring carcass one of the highest risk situations in grizzly country. The spring camper who sets up near what appears to be an old, weathered pile of bones or hair has potentially established camp within the defense radius of a bear that considers those remains, however unpromising they look to a human, a nutritionally critical resource that justifies aggressive defense. The summer period, between the spring emergence and the fall hyperphagia, is the lower risk period in the annual cycle, in a relative sense only. It is still the period during which the majority of human grizzly encounters occur, because it is the period during which the majority of human recreational activity in grizzly country occurs. The encounters are more likely to be investigative or defensive from surprise in character, and less likely to be driven by the intense food-seeking motivation of hyperphagia. But the volume of human activity in the landscape during summer means that the absolute number of encounters is highest in this window, even if the per-encounter risk from a food-motivated bear is lower than in fall. The grizzly population recovery that has occurred in the contiguous United States since the Yellowstone population was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1975 is one of the genuine success stories of the North American conservation record, and it creates exactly the kind of management complexity that successful conservation inevitably produces. The Yellowstone population, estimated at approximately 150 animals at the time of listing, has grown to more than 700 individuals and has expanded its range significantly beyond the greater Yellowstone ecosystem boundaries. The Northern Continental Divide population, centered in Glacier National Park and the surrounding landscape, has grown similarly and has been expanding its range southward into areas of Montana, where grizzlies were not present for generations. These are conservation outcomes that the Endangered Species Act was designed to produce, and that decades of intensive management and funding made possible. They are also outcomes that place increasing numbers of grizzly bears in landscapes that contain increasing numbers of humans engaged in camping, hiking, hunting, and ranching activities, and the encounter rate that results from this overlap has been increasing steadily. The incidents reported to wildlife managers in both the Yellowstone and Glacier areas have trended upward over the past 2 decades in a pattern that reflects the population growth and range expansion without indicating a per-bear change in the frequency of aggressive behavior. More bears, in more places, encountering more people, produces more encounters. A stable fraction of those encounters produces incidents. The absolute number of incidents increases as the numerator grows, even if the fraction stays constant. Wildlife managers tracking this trend understand it clearly. The public communication challenge is to convey the trend honestly, without